There's a strange pattern that appears in the financial lives of many people. Early in their careers, they believe that once they earn more money, their financial stress will disappear. A higher salary feels like the solution to everything. And for a short time, it actually does feel that way. The first bigger paycheck arrives. Suddenly there's room for a nicer apartment, better restaurants, maybe even a new car. Life feels like it's finally moving forward. But something unexpected starts to happen. The more income increases, the more expenses quietly expand alongside it. A slightly nicer lifestyle slowly becomes the new normal. And before long, the financial freedom that once seemed close begins to feel just as far away as before. Economists have a name for this pattern: lifestyle inflation. And it's one of the most powerful financial traps that quietly keeps millions of people financially stuck. Think about what most people believe about money when they're starting out. There's usually a version of this mental promise they make to themselves: once I earn more, everything will be easier. Once I cross a certain income level, I won't have to worry. The number changes depending on who you ask. For some it's 50,000 a year, for others it's 6 figures, and for some it keeps moving higher. But the structure of the belief stays the same. Higher income equals financial freedom. It seems logical. It seems almost obvious. And it's an idea that gets reinforced constantly. You watch people who earn more than you drive nicer cars. You notice that colleagues at higher salary levels seem to travel more, eat better, live in more impressive apartments. The signal everywhere around you is that income and quality of life move together in a straight line. Earn more, struggle less. That's the deal. But here's what almost nobody explains clearly enough. The deal only works if spending stays below income. And something deeply human tends to get in the way of that. When income goes up, spending tends to follow. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, steadily, in a way that feels completely reasonable in the moment. A nicer apartment seems justified when you've worked hard for a promotion. A better car feels earned after years of driving something that's been unreliable. A higher food budget seems like one of the small pleasures of finally getting ahead. Each individual decision seems thoughtful. Each one feels like a reasonable reward for progress. But together, they form a pattern. And that pattern has a way of eating the raise before it ever turns into financial security. This is not a new observation. Economists and researchers have watched it happen across income levels for decades. And yet it keeps repeating, quietly and reliably, in the financial lives of millions of people who believe they were simply improving their standard of living. The moment usually arrives with a promotion or a meaningful raise. Something shifts in how a person sees themselves. There's a real sense of arrival. The months or years of effort, the late hours, the accumulated patience, they've finally produced something visible. The number on the paycheck is different now. There's a legitimate feeling of having moved forward. And the first instinct, for most people, is to mark it somehow. To make the change visible in everyday life. For a lot of people, it starts with housing. The lease is coming up anyway. The old apartment was always a little cramped, always a little inconvenient in some way you'd learn to tolerate. And now, with the new salary, a better place is genuinely affordable, at least according to the basic math. So the move happens. The new apartment is bigger. The neighborhood is quieter, or closer to good restaurants, or simply nicer in that abstract way that feels important when you're starting to earn what you believe you deserve. The rent is higher, but the salary can handle it. That's how it's framed. The salary can handle it. Not long after that, the car often becomes the next thing. Or maybe it's the wardrobe, now that there are client meetings or a new professional environment to dress for. Or the gym membership at the better facility. Or the decision to stop eating lunch from the sad desk drawer and start going to actual restaurants. Each one of these upgrades seems reasonable. Each one is framed as appropriate to the new income level. And in isolation, every single one of them might be. The problem is what happens when you add them together. What most people don't notice in real time is that they're not just spending more money, they're building a new cost structure. The rent isn't just a monthly payment, it's a floor that everything else now stands on. The car payment, the insurance on the newer car, the monthly gym membership, the daily lunch, the streaming services, the weekend plans now priced for someone at this income level, they accumulate into a new baseline. A new normal. A new version of just getting by that happens to cost much more than the old version. And here's the part that surprises people most when they finally sit down and look at the numbers: the gap between what they earn and what they spend hasn't grown. In many cases, it's narrowed. The raise arrived, and somehow the raise disappeared too. The paycheck is bigger now, but the month still ends the same way. Maybe with a small cushion. Maybe with a feeling that there's just not quite enough to really get ahead. This is the first upgrade cycle. And it almost never registers as a trap while it's happening. It registers as progress. What makes lifestyle inflation so persistent isn't that people are careless with money. Most of the people caught in this pattern are genuinely thoughtful about their decisions. They're comparing prices. They're making considered choices. They're not recklessly splurging on things they don't want. The spending feels deliberate. And that's partly why it's so hard to see clearly. The expansion happens across several layers at once. There's the obvious layer, the big visible upgrades like housing and transportation. But then there's a quieter layer underneath, made up of hundreds of small decisions that individually feel trivial. The grocery store changes. Not dramatically, but it does. Maybe there's a nicer option that's slightly more expensive, but the quality is better and it's on the way home. The restaurant choices shift. The $12 lunch that used to feel like a treat becomes the default, and the $25 dinner becomes ordinary. The vacation that was once a budget camping trip becomes a city break in a hotel, and then it becomes a week abroad, because that's what feels appropriate now for someone at this point in their career. Convenience spending grows almost invisibly. When income is tight, people solve problems with time, they cook from scratch, they wait, they plan ahead. When income grows, money starts substituting for time. The grocery delivery. The cleaning service. The prepared meals. The Uber instead of the bus. Each one seems like a perfectly sensible trade, and in isolation each one is. But together, they represent a shift in the entire operating cost of daily life. Robert Johnson, a finance professor at Creighton University, described this pattern with blunt clarity. People move into a bigger apartment, buy a more expensive car, and reward themselves for a raise, and then find themselves unable to improve their financial condition because they spend everything they make. The reward consumed the progress. There's also a social dimension to how spending expands, and it operates in ways that most people don't fully acknowledge. When your income changes, your social context often changes alongside it. Colleagues at the new level live a certain way. Friendships shift toward people with similar lifestyles. The implicit benchmark of what seems normal, what a reasonable person does on a weekend, what a decent vacation looks like, what kind of apartment someone at your stage should be living in, all of that quietly recalibrates. And without consciously deciding to keep up with anyone, people find themselves spending in a way that matches the expectations of the environment they've moved into. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, Americans were saving an average of just 3.8% of disposable income at the end of 2024, a figure dramatically lower than savings rates from earlier decades, when incomes were significantly lower in real terms. The money is there. The savings rate suggests something else is happening to it. To understand why lifestyle inflation is so hard to resist, it helps to look at what's actually happening psychologically when income increases. There's a concept in behavioral economics called hedonic adaptation. Psychologists describe it as the process by which human beings return to a relatively stable baseline level of happiness after positive or negative life events. In other words, the emotional impact of any change, good or bad, tends to fade over time. The new car that felt thrilling in week 1 becomes ordinary by month 3. The new apartment that felt spacious and beautiful when you moved in becomes simply where you live. Behavioral economists sometimes call this the hedonic treadmill. You keep moving, spending keeps rising, but the feeling of satisfaction keeps returning to roughly the same place. The positive boost from a purchase wears off quickly. What was once a reward becomes an expectation. What was once a luxury becomes a baseline. This isn't a personal failing. It's a documented feature of human psychology, observed across cultures and income levels. Psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell described versions of this adaptation phenomenon decades ago. The pattern appears whether the life change is a major purchase, a new living situation, or a dramatic shift in income. The initial spike in happiness is real, and then it fades, and the mind recalibrates to the new normal. What this means practically is that each upgrade resets the reference point. The nicer apartment doesn't produce sustained satisfaction, it produces a new floor below which things feel unacceptable. The better car doesn't permanently elevate mood, it establishes a new minimum standard for what feels tolerable. And so the next raise produces the next round of upgrades, not because the old level was genuinely bad, but because the emotional baseline has moved. Morgan Housel captures something important about this in The Psychology of Money. He draws a distinction between being wealthy and being rich that cuts directly to what lifestyle inflation does. Being rich, he explains, is about what you can spend right now, the visible, outward signs of income. Being wealthy is about what you have in reserve, the money that hasn't been spent. Wealth, by its nature, is largely invisible. You cannot see someone's savings rate at a dinner party. You cannot observe another person's investment account from the street. What you can see is the car, the apartment, the restaurant, the vacation photo. And so the signals that register socially are almost exclusively signals of spending, not signals of actual financial health. This creates a quiet but powerful pressure. The sociologist Thorstein Veblen described it in 1899, in a world completely unlike our own, and yet the basic observation has remained accurate ever since. Veblen called it conspicuous consumption, the tendency to acquire and display goods as signals of social standing rather than purely for their utility. The specific goods change with every generation. The underlying psychology does not. People spend partly to signal something to the world around them, competence, success, arrival. And income increases provide the budget to do more of it. In today's environment, that pressure has intensified in a way Veblen couldn't have imagined. Social media makes the conspicuous consumption of thousands of people, including colleagues, former classmates, acquaintances, perpetually visible. Research on social comparison theory, originally developed by psychologist Leon Festinger, suggests that people naturally evaluate themselves against others, particularly against those who are slightly ahead of them. In a world where Instagram and LinkedIn provide a constant stream of curated financial signals from people in your reference group, that comparison never stops. A Goldman Sachs report noted explicitly that the financial anxiety among high earners appears to stem from lifestyle creep, the phenomenon of luxuries becoming necessities for certain income cohorts. Social pressure, the report found, doesn't fade with income. It scales with it. What Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist, has described throughout his work is that human beings are deeply inconsistent about evaluating their own choices when they're embedded in social context. The reference point isn't absolute, it's relative. It shifts depending on what the people around you are doing. And so the same person who was genuinely content with a modest apartment at one income level finds themselves genuinely dissatisfied with a similar apartment after a promotion, not because their needs have changed, but because their reference point has. The data on this pattern is striking, and the numbers don't entirely match the story most people tell themselves about higher earners. A Goldman Sachs workplace report found that roughly 40% of workers earning more than $300,000 a year report living paycheck to paycheck. Among those earning between $300,000 and $500,000, that figure sits at 41%. Meanwhile, workers earning between $100,000 and $200,000 were actually less likely, only about 25%, to report the same thing. It's a counterintuitive finding. People earning less, at that level, were keeping more of a cushion than people earning dramatically more. The report's authors pointed to lifestyle creep directly as the likely explanation, luxuries becoming necessities, as they phrased it. Goldman Sachs also noted that the cost of basic needs like housing, education, and childcare has risen dramatically since 2000, outpacing median wage growth significantly. Homeownership now requires roughly half of median income, compared to about a third 25 years ago. So part of the squeeze is structural. But part of it is the inflation that people build voluntarily into their own lives. In 2025, a Credit Ninja analysis found something that seemed almost paradoxical. Americans earning $100,000 a year were more likely to report living paycheck to paycheck than those earning $50,000. The $50,000 earner had adapted their life to a certain cost structure. The $100,000 earner had built a cost structure that consumed the entire income. Living paycheck to paycheck, for a growing number of people, is no longer a description of poverty. It's a description of a spending pattern. A Bank of America Institute report from late 2025 found that nearly a quarter of American households are living paycheck to paycheck, and among higher-income households, lifestyle creep was cited as a primary driver. As one analyst described it, you bought a house, you bought a couple of cars, and before you know it, all your money is going out to bills. This is also one of the clearest illustrations of a distinction Morgan Housel makes in the psychology of money, that more important than extraordinary income is the ability to save and avoid lifestyle inflation. The math of wealth building isn't complicated. What makes it difficult is the behavior. And the behavior, it turns out, is heavily shaped by psychology that higher income does nothing to solve. The convenience economy makes this considerably harder. Easy credit, buy now pay later platforms, same-day delivery, and subscription services have made spending frictionless in a way that previous generations never experienced. When spending feels low effort and nearly invisible, the mental accounting becomes blurry. Small charges accumulate into significant monthly costs without ever producing the kind of conscious decision that would allow a person to evaluate whether they actually want to make that trade. Dan Ariely, in his research on consumer psychology, has explored how the pain of payment, the psychological discomfort of parting with money, is dramatically reduced when transactions are abstract. Cash produces more felt cost than credit. A single subscription charge for $12.99 barely registers. But 6 of them add up to nearly $1,000 a year, on things a person might not even use consistently. Here's what makes the lifestyle inflation trap particularly difficult to escape once it's established. The new baseline doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like a life. After the upgrades happen, after the nicer apartment, the better car, the expanded social life, the convenience spending, a person's sense of what they need to be comfortable has genuinely shifted. The changes weren't forced on them. They made deliberate decisions that felt reasonable. And now those decisions have locked in a cost structure that requires a certain income just to sustain. The margin that should have grown as income grew has stayed thin. The financial stress that was supposed to disappear with higher earnings is still there, slightly repackaged. And perhaps the most subtle part of the trap is this, because each upgrade happened at a time when income genuinely could cover it, nothing ever feels irresponsible. The person who earns $90,000 and spends $88,000 is not living lavishly by most visible measures. They're not driving a Ferrari. They're not staying in 5-star hotels. They're just living a comfortable middle-class life that happens to cost almost exactly what they earn, leaving almost nothing to build on. The next raise will probably close that gap for a few months. And then spending will quietly rise to meet it again. That's the mechanism. That's the treadmill. A research paper examining consumption peer effects found what economists described as an intertemporal distortion of spending profiles, the tendency for people to shape their current spending around their peer group's behavior rather than around their own long-term financial interests. The effect isn't small. Researchers estimated that own consumption responds to peer consumption with an elasticity of roughly 0.3, meaning that when the people around you spend more, your spending increases meaningfully, even when your income hasn't changed. Now take that same dynamic and apply it to a situation where income has increased and the social group has shifted upward, and the pattern becomes clear. This is also why the conventional advice, just save more when you earn more, tends not to work without a deliberate structural intervention. The psychology of the situation works against it. The hedonic baseline has risen. The social reference group has shifted. The cost structure is locked in with fixed expenses like rent and car payments. And every signal from every direction suggests that a person earning at this level should be living a certain way. Morgan Housel describes what he calls saving the raise as a powerful counter-strategy, the idea that every income increase goes directly into savings or investments before it has a chance to become lifestyle. The principle is simple, almost obvious. But it runs against the entire grain of how most people experience a pay increase, which is as permission to make the apartment a little nicer, the car a little newer, the life a little more comfortable. The distinction that matters here, the one that tends to be invisible until someone looks back over years rather than months, is between growing income and growing wealth. Income is what comes in. Wealth is the gap between what comes in and what goes out. A person can grow their income substantially over a decade and end up with very little wealth to show for it, if spending has grown alongside every step. As Morgan Housel writes, wealth is largely what you don't see. It's the money that wasn't spent. The car not bought. The apartment not upgraded. The raise that went into an account rather than into a monthly cost. The people who seem to navigate this pattern most successfully aren't necessarily the highest earners. They're often people who found a lifestyle they genuinely liked, not a minimal one, not a deprived one, but one that had room for pleasure and comfort, and then held it roughly steady as income grew. Every dollar that didn't go toward upgrading the baseline went somewhere it could compound. This isn't about asceticism. It's not about never spending on things that matter. Housel is clear on this point. The goal is intentional spending, not minimal spending. The question is whether the spending aligns with what actually produces lasting satisfaction versus what merely signals a level of success to the world around you. What behavioral research consistently finds is that experiences tend to produce more lasting happiness than possessions, partly because they resist hedonic adaptation more effectively. A trip you took 5 years ago still produces memories. The car you drove 5 years ago has long since become unremarkable. The luxury restaurant you visited once stays vivid, the expensive gym membership you pay for every month barely registers anymore. The problem isn't wanting a good life. The problem is the specific pattern where every income increase immediately converts into a higher baseline of spending, leaving the gap between earning and keeping permanently narrow. That's the mechanism of the trap. Not dramatic financial disasters. Not single catastrophic decisions. Just a quiet, incremental expansion of normal that keeps pace with income so reliably that financial progress becomes invisible, year after year. What makes lifestyle inflation worth understanding, really understanding, beyond the surface level, is that it operates below the threshold of awareness. Nobody decides to let their spending absorb every raise. Nobody consciously chooses to run the treadmill. It happens through the accumulation of individually reasonable decisions, made under the influence of hedonic adaptation, social comparison, and a culture that constantly reinforces spending as the appropriate expression of financial arrival. The income wasn't the problem. The income was real progress. What failed to keep pace was the understanding of what that progress actually required in terms of behavior to mean anything. Higher income, by itself, doesn't create financial freedom. The gap between what comes in and what goes out creates financial freedom. And that gap is something that has to be protected actively, deliberately, against the constant quiet pressure to let it close. There's a version of this realization that, once it lands, changes how a person looks at the financial lives around them. The colleague in the expensive car, the friend in the impressive apartment, the acquaintance posting from a resort, none of it reveals anything reliable about what's actually happening in their financial life. What's visible is spending. What's invisible is whether any of it is building anything. Morgan Housel describes it as the man in the car paradox. When you see someone driving an expensive car, you don't think about how impressive they are. You imagine yourself in that car, and how impressive you would look. The car is a signal aimed at an audience. And the audience, it turns out, is mostly just doing the same thing. This is the trap that lifestyle inflation builds, a life that looks like financial success while functioning like a financial treadmill. More income, more spending, more comfort, more cost, and approximately the same amount of progress toward the thing that most people actually want, which is the freedom to stop worrying about money. Earning more is genuinely valuable. The problem isn't the raise. It's what happens the moment after the raise arrives, when the mind starts calculating what's now possible, and mistaking what's possible to spend for what's wise to spend. That's the gap. That's what almost nobody talks about when they talk about earning more money. And understanding it is, quietly, one of the most financially important things a person can do.